So today's message is on Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 to 4. So if you've got your Bibles with you, please turn to Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 to 4. As I said before, we're starting a 3-week series on how to resist temptation in our lives. So over the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at the entirety of the passage of Matthew 4, verses 1 to 12, looking at the temptation of Jesus in the desert. And today's sermon is all about trusting in God's providence as being a really good means for us to resist temptation in our lives. Now, temptation can come to us both when we're at our highest point in our lives, and it can also come to us when we're at our lowest point in our lives. And for Jesus, we see that this happened at both. So what's just happened previous to the passage we're looking at today is that Jesus gets baptized. There's this massive event in human history. Jesus gets baptized in the water by John the Baptist. The heavens open up. The Holy Spirit descends like a dove on Jesus. God the Father's there. He speaks, he praises God the Son, Jesus Christ. All three aspects of God present in one defining moment. And I remember when I look back at my life, my baptism was a huge moment of joy in my life. And I'm sure it would have been a huge moment in the life of Jesus as well, just to be able to have that moment of being connected to God the Father and the Holy Spirit, and just all three aspects of God united at one key moment. So let's move on and let's have a look at the passage before us. So in Matthew chapter 4, and we'll begin in verse 1. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he then became hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread." But he answered and said, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God." What we see here is the tempter, Satan. He's directly challenging God's providence. He's come to Jesus at his lowest point. He's had his highest point. Now he's at his lowest point. He hasn't eaten for 40 days and 40 nights. And this might sound very challenging to some people, to hear that someone fasted for 40 days and 40 nights and is still alive. But there are recordings of monks who have been able to pull this off. Okay? So there are a lot of people in human history who have been able to fast for 40 days and 40 nights, but there are a few recorded examples of people who have been able to fast for 40 days and 40 nights. Okay? So a long extended fast is not something that you need to kind of look at here and go, "Oh, it's a bit off, it's a bit strange." Okay? It's definitely within the realms of possibility. So Jesus did indeed fast for 40 days and 40 nights. And here at his most vulnerable, he's hungry. He needs food. He needs nutrition. He needs sustenance. He's been alone. Alone, it says. Okay? So spiritually, he's at his weakest as well. He hasn't been around other people. It's just been him and his God. He's been alone. He's hungry. He's starving. He's in a weakened state, both mentally, physically, and spiritually. And this is the challenge that the tempter puts to him. Where is God? You're hungry, but God's not providing. There's no food. So the challenge that tempter puts to Jesus is provide for yourself. After all, You're the Son of God. You can raise people from the dead. You can exorcise demons. You can create food out of very little food en masse. You can calm the storms. You can calm the weather. Surely you can turn these stones into bread. Give yourself some sustenance. Give yourself some food. Give yourself some nutrition. Make yourself better. It's definitely something that Jesus could easily have done. And as I said before, temptation is going to come to each and every one of us in our lives. It's part of what makes us human. We wouldn't be human if we weren't vulnerable to being temptation. When humanity is stained with sin, the idea that I want to do the things that I know that I shouldn't, and the idea that I don't want to do the things that I know that I should. And this is where the temptation comes into our hearts. It's so easy for those little whispers that come from the tempter and say to us, it's okay. You don't need to do that thing that you know that you should do. Go do something that you want to do instead. It's okay. You don't need to do the right thing. Go do the thing that you know that you shouldn't. Okay? It's very easy for the tempter to get to us to do that because it's in our nature to be tempted and it's in our nature to sin. So as Christians, when we're at our lowest point, when things aren't going well in life, and I've had many low points in my own life, have a tornado rip the side of your house off, have a near fatal car accident, get shifted forcibly to a new location for work. It's just an example of the ones I've had just in the last few years, not to mention the whole 38 years of my life to date. So there's many low points that are going to happen in our lives. And when we're in those low points, it can be very difficult to see God's provision. Very difficult to see God's provision. When you're in the pit, when you're at your lowest point, you know, whether or not you're experiencing mental health on top of that with depression and anxiety and stress, financial difficulties, you've lost your job, whatever the mounting toll that's in your heart and in your life that's weighing you down, that's bringing you down to your lowest point. It's at those points it's very difficult to see God's provision in our lives. And then it's very easy to, as like Jesus, to be tempted, to have that little voice that says, where's my God? He's not providing for me right now. I haven't got a job. My income's been slashed. I've got repair bills. I've lost possessions. People I love have died and passed away, possibly under tragic circumstances. You know, I miss them. It doesn't seem right. And we start to go, where's God? Where's God in this? I can't see how he's providing for me in this situation. I can't see the way out. I can't see him at all. And it's at that point when we're at our lowest that just as the tempter did to Jesus and said, turn those stones into bread, provide for yourself. That's how he gets us on those low points as well. He says, God's not providing for you. He's not there. You're feeling miserable. So go off and sin. Go off and buy yourself something that maybe you can't afford. Steward your money in ways that you shouldn't do it. You know, drink something, smoke something, inject something. You know, feel some need in your heart that needs to be fulfilled that you wouldn't feel otherwise if you were following closely in God. But he's not here right now. He's not providing for you. So, hey, it's all right. Go nuts, right? Do something that's going to make you feel better in this terrible, miserable situation that you're in. It's the same challenge that the tempter put to Jesus, provide for yourself. Where's God? He's not providing for you. And it's the same challenge that he gets to us when our hearts are at our lowest, the same temptation. Just go off and sin. Do the things that you know that you shouldn't do. Don't do the things that you know you should do. He's not here. He's absent. Where is he? Gets you right at your weakest. But as I said before, he also gets Christians when they're at their highest point as well. Okay? They're equally difficult times. Because we become complacent. We become complacent. We lose sight of the fact that God is the reason why everything is going well in our lives. So just when things are going bad and there's this perceived absence of God's provision, when things are going extremely well in our lives, we forget the reason why things are going really well, because we've been provided them by God. When you've got your job, when you've got your steady income, when you've got a roof over your head, car to drive, everyone's well in your family, everyone's got good health, when things are at their best, that's when you become complacent and you forget about the person who gave you all these things and provided for you instead. And then that complacency builds pride. And when we forget that it was God that was providing to us at all, we equally lose sight of God. We equally lose sight of God's providence in our lives. And then the temptation comes in again, not because you can't see his provision, but because you're blinded by the fact that he has provided for you. You claim that that provision has come from some other means. Maybe you think it came from yourself. I worked hard. I earned my money. I've been paying all my bills. I'm the reason why I got my financial security. I look after myself, my health. You start to say that the reason that things are going well in your life is because of you, not because of God. And we see in Genesis, that's how he gets them again then, isn't it? And the story of Adam and Eve, that account that tells us about how humanity is fallen and sinful in its nature, what does he say to them? Well, did God really say that? You're not going to surely die if you eat of the fruit. No. You'll be gods just like him. And when we lose sight of God's providence in our lives, we become, in our own minds, a God like him. We get this idea in our heads that we're the reason why we have our success. And we're the reason why we've provided so much around us. And we attribute it to ourselves and not to the person high above who gave it to us. And like I said, that brings pride into our heart and it makes us equally vulnerable to sin. And I know I've been there. I've been tempted when things are going well. And then that's usually when afterwards it's like I feel the greatest guilt because I think to myself, God was providing for me. Things were going really well. And I lost sight of my God, and now I've committed this sin. Because we succumbed to temptation and we lost sight of God's providence. So at either extreme, we are at our most vulnerable to temptation. And we're vulnerable to temptation all the time, no doubt. But at those two extremes, we're definitely at our most vulnerable. So how do we guard our hearts? Okay, we've already established the fact that we're going to be tempted. Humanity's been tempted its whole entire existence, and humanity has sin in its heart, this desire that I want to do things that I shouldn't do and not do the things I know that I should. So we're going to be very vulnerable to temptation the entirety of our existence here. So how do we deal with that? How do we prevent ourselves from getting tempted as often? What do we say to ourselves in those moments when we are tempted? What are some strategies and solutions that we can employ in our hearts to guard them against temptation, but also resist it when we're at our weakest, when we're at our most vulnerable point? Well, Jesus gives us the answer, doesn't he? When he's tempted to provide for himself, something which he is absolutely able to do, beyond a shadow of doubt, he can turn stones to bread, like that, if you wanted to. Okay? What does he say instead? Well, he quotes a passage from Deuteronomy 8:3, a passage that relates directly to God's providence. He says, "Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God." So let's now turn to Deuteronomy 8, verses 1 to 3. So that's in your Old Testament. So you've got to get way past all the minor prophets, the wisdom literature, the narratives. If you get the numbers, you've gone too far. Yeah, I know, right? You wouldn't expect it, would you? But it is. Yep. All right. So chapter 8, verses 1 to 3 of Deuteronomy. All the commandments that I am commanding you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to give to your forefathers. You shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. He humbled you and let you be hungry and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. Proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. See, in this passage, he's reminding his people of his providence and his plans. Okay? He made a promise to them of this land that would be their own, that would be their home. But the promise didn't come to fruition straight away. It took 40 years of wandering. It's a multi-generational promise. You know, the kids that would have heard this would have been grandpups, you know, with little ones on their knee telling them about this promise by the time it was fulfilled, right? And I imagine the generation in between would have been getting really tired of hearing about this promise that wasn't being fulfilled. There would have been a lot of grumbling and mumbling and just not happy, okay? So this is a multi-generational promise by God. One that has this component to it of his people recognizing his providence, his gift of food when they were hungry. Wasn't necessarily there all the time, but it was there. You could see it. It came up every once in a while. And then the ultimate fulfillment of providence, the fact that the promise got fulfilled. They got to get to their Holy Land. They got to get to where their new home was going to be. And that God looks at this and says, there were some trials there. There was some testing. I was seeing where your heart was at with relationship to me, with your love to me, with your love and trust in me about the fact that I would provide for you. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. Sometimes you couldn't see my provision. Sometimes the provision wasn't always there. But it was a steady stream of God having your back, providing for you, and ultimately fulfilling the promise that he had made to his people. And in that, the flip side was the expectation that the people over those 40 years would remain with their hearts in line to God, that they would continue to love and trust God no matter how difficult it got. No matter how difficult it was to see God's providence, they would trust in the promise and that they would obey his commandments regardless of how tough it got. And the end there speaks about how man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. We have to understand that if God speaks, something happens. God speaks, something happens. Okay? You see this in Genesis chapter 1. God's created the universe, and then he steps in, he's right, I'm going to assign function and purpose, the different aspects of a previously created universe. You know, I'm going to have seasons, I'm going to have agriculture, I'm going to have husbandry, I'm going to have food, I'm going to have people that I can dwell with in relationship for all eternity. I'm going to assign all of these things into my beautiful cosmic temple that is the universe that I have created and the earth that I have decided to place my people on, to have relationship with. And every single sentence that comes out, it's like, let there be, right? Let there be this function. Let there be this attributed to that which I've already created. He speaks and it happens. Okay? He speaks and it happens. Everything that's provided to us comes from the very mouth of God. That's how it works, okay? And we live in a world which through the divine revelation in nature shows us that there is a God. The complexity that is around us, if we were to step out of this room right now and walk, literally 50 meters down the hill, you're going to see beautiful trees. They're providing us oxygen. They're taking away CO2, which is harmful to us. You're going to see all the life forms that live in there as part of the ecosystem. You're going to see birds. I mean, they don't stress or worry. That's what Jesus is going to tell us later on when we get into the Sermon on the Mount. They don't stress because they see God's provision in their lives. They know that it's there. He's providing for all this different life all around us. Nature is a constant revelation to the fact that God speaks and he provides. When he speaks, it just happens. His commands. There's provision all around us for us to see, but often our eyes are completely closed off to that. Especially in the 21st century when everything is all, technologically orientated. We've got our heads in some kind of device. Our lives are structured around the things that we need to do, like jobs and work and activities. It's just so difficult, especially when we're surrounded by man-made structures and man-made constructs. It's so difficult to peel all that back and just look at the simplicity, which is birds in trees, wind going through leaves, all of these complex systems that God has put in place simply by speaking them into existence. They're testimony to God's providence. Just as it was when manna came from heaven to God's people as they were in the wilderness for 40 years, he spoke and he provided from that speaking. Food came to them. This is what Jesus is ultimately reminding us of. He's reminding us of God's providence in our lives, right down to the very smallest detail. And we just lose sight of it sometimes. We lose sight of it when things are going really well, and we lose sight of it when things are going very badly. And as we look at this passage, we see that God wants us to obey his commands. And he knows that we'll be tempted. There's this duality here, okay? He wants us to obey his commands, and he knows that we'll be tempted. He knows our nature. He knows that we're vulnerable. He knows that we're vulnerable to losing sight of who's really in control in our lives, God. He knows that we're vulnerable to losing sight of his providence in our lives. He knows this. Okay? So this is why he reminds us in this passage, and the reason why Jesus speaks it to the tempter when he is being tempted, because he's reminding us of God's providence so that we can guard our hearts in the future. We guard our hearts in the present, and we guard our hearts in the future. So what happens when we're tempted? What's going on in our brains? That's a very interesting question, okay? Now, if I said to you, do not focus on elephants. Do not focus on elephants. Don't think about those big grey beasts, little curly tails, big floppy ears, trunk. Whatever you do, don't think about an elephant. Just don't do it. Just put it out of your mind. Don't think about elephants whatsoever. Don't think about how they pick up the water out of the pond and they squirt it out and just do all these amazing things. Don't even think about the noise that they make out of their trunk. Just don't think about elephants. Guarantee you every single person in this room is thinking about an elephant, and there's probably a really good chance that you're going to be thinking about an elephant for the rest of the day now as well, because that's how the human brain works. When you don't want to think about something, if you sit there and go, don't think about sin, don't think about sin, don't think about sin, I really shouldn't sin, don't want to sin, it's not good if I sin, don't sin, don't sin, don't sin, don't sin. What are you thinking about? You're thinking about sin. You're thinking about the exact same thing that you're trying to avoid. You're just inadvertently doing it. You just don't even realize you're doing it. So constantly, the thing that's tempting you, the thing that is probably going to, might potentially make you feel better in that moment, You're going, no, don't think about it, don't think about it, don't think about it, don't think about it, don't think about it. But you're inadvertently thinking about it. You're thinking about the very thing they're trying not to do. And what is most likely going to happen? You're going to do it. You're going to give up. You're going to be overwhelmed. You're going to be like, I can't do this. It's too difficult. I can't stop thinking about it. I'm just going to give up. That's it. Sin. I'll get back on the horse another day. I'll confess. I'll apologize. I'll be remorseful. Just, no, can't do it. Too tough. Can't stop thinking about it. Got to do it. It's because that's all you could think about. Your brain you already were unstuck the moment you tried really, really hard to not think about it, because all you were going to do was keep thinking about it, which inadvertently kept telling you about the fact, well, this is going to make you feel better. It's going to be good. And then you give up. You give in. It's too tough. You're making life very difficult for yourself if you do that. So if I tell you not to focus on elephants, you're going to focus on elephants. Okay? If you tell yourself not to focus on sin, you're going to focus on the very sin that you're trying really hard not to do. Okay? So when we're being tempted to sin, okay, the answer is not to tell ourselves not to do it. The answer is not to go, I shouldn't do it because of blah, 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 blah. You know, I'm going to regret it. It's just whatever. Because part of your brain's still going to be thinking about the fact it's going to be really good. You know, if I don't tell that person the truth, life is going to be so much easier. If I go look at that site, go look at that video, go drink whatever this is, inject whatever that is, buy whatever this is, like, you know, not go and help that person because my life's going to be way easier if I just go and do my own thing. Whatever it is, okay? Whatever it is, whatever you're being tempted to do at that time, you need to redirect your thoughts to something other than that from which you are being tempted. And God and Jesus have given us the answer right here in these two passages. It says, redirect your thoughts to me. Redirect your thoughts to God. Redirect your thoughts to the providence that I have in your lives. The past providence that I've had in your life. You might not be able to see it directly in your life right now, so think about the providence I had in your life in the past. Think about my attributes. Step outside. Whew, I can't do any of that stuff. God's in complete control of that massive complexity of an ecosystem and construct, which is the entirety of Earth and the universe. He's got that one under control. I can't do that. There's another classic example of God's providence. I mean, the fact that I'm still alive, he hasn't taken me. An act of grace, I'm still here on the planet. There's God's providence. You start to think about him, his power, his attributes, all the ways that he's providing for you. And it's a distraction technique, at the very least, okay? Because you're not thinking about the elephant anymore. You're not thinking about the elephant in the room, sin. You've moved on. You've got your brain thinking about something far better. You're thinking about God. You're thinking about him, all his attributes, how great he is, all the providence in your lives. And then what's going to happen? The other thought is going to pass out of your brain. It's gone. Not there anymore. And instead, you've connected closer to God. You avoided temptation, at least for a couple of hours, days, some period of time before you get tempted again, maybe even about the same thing. But then you go back to it again. And you go back to it, you go back to it, you go back to it. And this is the solution to resisting temptation in your life. To trust God's providence, to meditate on God's providence, to meditate on his ways and his will in your life. Don't think about the thing you're being tempted about. Think about God instead. Because you see, like, God was calling his people to obey his commandments and his will. And he also understood that they were going to be tempted. Now, the thing is, if you don't respect somebody, or you have a very limited respect for somebody, or there's no love in your heart for somebody, it doesn't matter how good their advice is. You're not going to do it. The respect and trust and love of the other person has to be there. The greater the respect, the trust, and love, the more likely you are to accept what they're telling you, to accept their advice. And this is the other key. So we're all called to obey God's commandments, but we're going to be tempted to not obey God's commandments. We're going to be repeatedly tempted to not obey God's commandments. So not only does redirecting our minds at the moment that we're tempted to God help focus our energies on something else and help us to not focus on the thing that we don't want to do or we're trying very hard to resist doing, it also helps us to build our love and respect and trust for God because we're thinking about Him. We're thinking about all of His attributes. We're thinking about how much He's provided for us in our lives. And the greater the picture you have in your heart and in your soul for God and His provision in your life, the more likely you are to obey His will, the more likely you are to resist temptation. It's going to grow in your heart. It's going to be this thing that guards your heart against temptation in the future. Look, resisting temptation is hard. It's very hard. And there's going to be stumbles in your life. Guarantee it. Okay? You're not going to walk out of this room and master this like that. Okay? It takes time and practice. But the key to success in resisting temptation in your life is to think about God's providence in your life at the present time and in the past, to think about how great He is, to think about His attributes, to think about His love for you, His sacrificial love for you, the grace that He's bestowing upon you right now, that you're still here and that you're still alive. And to grow that in your heart deeper and deeper and deeper. Grow your love and respect and trust of God. That's how you both resist